Deep within the fog-shrouded hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the mountains rise like ancient sentinels guarding forgotten secrets, a traveling physician named Dr. Samuel Harrington stumbled upon something that would expose one of America's darkest family histories. It was autumn, with the leaves painting the hillsides in shades of rust and amber, when he discovered an abandoned cabin near Harlan County. Inside, beneath rotting floorboards and years of accumulated dust, lay a leather-bound journal that had belonged to a young woman who had lived and suffered in complete isolation from the outside world. The family had occupied these remote mountains since 1790, settling in a valley so secluded that even neighboring communities barely acknowledged their existence. For over 5 generations, they remained cut off from society, creating their own insular world where bloodlines tangled like the wild vines covering their property. The family patriarch had established strict rules. No outsider could marry into the family. No member could leave the valley. Family bonds were to remain unbroken at all costs. By 1912, the consequences of these rules had become devastatingly apparent. She was 19 years old when she began writing her diary, though her physical appearance suggested someone much older. Her words, written in shaky handwriting that deteriorated as the entries progressed, painted a portrait of a community ravaging itself from within. Dr. Harrington, a man of science from Boston who had dedicated his career to serving rural Appalachia, immediately recognized the medical significance of what he was reading. The diary described in painful detail the physical conditions affecting nearly every member of the clan. She wrote about her cousin brother, whose twisted spine forced him to walk bent nearly in half. She described her aunt mother, whose episodes of uncontrollable shaking had begun in her teenage years and never stopped. She chronicled the deaths of multiple infants born with conditions she couldn't name but described with heartbreaking precision. The first entry that caught Dr. Harrington's attention was dated March 5, 1911. She wrote, "Mama says I'm to wed Uncle Vernon come spring. His daddy's brother and also Mama's cousin. I asked why we can't bring someone from the town below, but Daddy struck me hard and said we only marry our own. That's how it's always been." The doctor's hands trembled as he turned the yellowed pages. The diary revealed that she herself was the product of a union between first cousins who were also second cousins through another branch of the family tree. Her parents shared the same grandfather and the same great-grandmother through different lines. The genetic consequences were mapped across her body in ways that 19th-century medicine was only beginning to understand. She described her own afflictions with a matter-of-fact tone that made them even more disturbing. Her teeth had grown in overlapping patterns, causing constant pain and making eating difficult. Her left eye wandered independently of her right, giving her perpetual headaches and limited vision. Her joints ached constantly, and by age 16, she had already lost several teeth. But it was her mind that concerned her most. She wrote about moments of confusion, times when she couldn't remember her own name, instances where she would find herself in the forest with no memory of how she got there. The compound consisted of 7 structures scattered across a narrow valley. Approximately 43 people lived there in 1912, though her diary suggested that number fluctuated as infants died with disturbing regularity and elderly members succumbed to conditions that seemed to accelerate their aging. Every single resident was related by blood, and most were related through multiple lines of descent. Dr. Harrington documented the family's history as he pieced it together from the entries. The isolation had begun innocently enough. The patriarch had moved his family into the mountains to escape what he called the corrupting influence of civilization. But somewhere in the second generation, practical necessity had given way to something darker. As his sons grew to marrying age, he had refused to let them seek wives from neighboring communities. Instead, he arranged unions between his children, justifying it with twisted interpretations of biblical passages and claims about keeping the family pure. By the third generation, the pattern was irreversible. They had become so genetically intertwined that they couldn't recognize the damage they were perpetuating. Brothers married sisters, uncles wed nieces, first cousins paired off as routinely as unrelated couples might in the outside world. And with each generation, the physical and mental consequences compounded. An entry from July 19, 1911, revealed the full horror of her situation. "Baby Ruth was born last night. She came out wrong. All twisted up like a rag someone wrung dry. Lived maybe an hour. Mama buried her behind the cabin before dawn. That makes 6 babies in 2 years that didn't make it. Daddy says it's God's will. But I see how Mama looks at the ground when she thinks nobody's watching. The most chilling aspect of the diary wasn't the physical descriptions, but her growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with her family. Unlike the older members, who accepted their circumstances as normal, she had somehow developed a critical perspective. Perhaps it was because she had once glimpsed a traveling preacher who had accidentally wandered into their valley. Perhaps it was because she had found old newspapers that blew in from neighboring counties. Whatever the reason, she knew her family was different, and she knew that difference was destroying them. Dr. Harrington found himself reading late into the night, unable to stop, despite the growing horror he felt. He read about William, who at age 28 had the mental capacity of a young child. He read about Sarah, whose seizures came so frequently that she spent most days restrained to prevent injury. He read about the twins, Jacob and Joseph, born joined at the hip and separated by their grandfather with a heated blade and whiskey as anesthetic. Joseph died within days. Jacob lived, but his screams echoed through the valley for weeks. Because what you're about to discover goes deeper than any history book dared to print, and these hidden bloodlines won't stay buried forever. Dr. Harrington closed the diary as dawn light filtered through the broken cabin windows. His medical training had exposed him to countless human sufferings, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic genetic catastrophe documented in those words. He knew he needed to find out what happened to them, to understand whether any had survived, and to learn her fate. The nearest town, Harland, sat 15 miles northwest through treacherous mountain paths. When Dr. Harrington arrived with the diary, the local sheriff, a weathered man named Clayton Burke, listened to his account with growing unease. Sheriff Burke had lived in these mountains his entire 53 years, and he knew the stories whispered about that valley, though he had always dismissed them as mountain superstition. Together, they assembled a small expedition: Dr. Harrington, Sheriff Burke, a deputy named Thomas Webb, and a local guide named Abraham Cole, who claimed to know the way to the compound. As they climbed into the higher elevations, Abraham shared what he knew. They had been trading with a general store in a tiny settlement called Gray's Knob until about 1900. After that, they stopped coming down from the mountains entirely. Rumors circulated about why. Some said they had all died from a fever. Others claimed they had moved west. A few whispered darker theories about what happened when families married too close for too long. The journey took 2 days. The terrain grew increasingly hostile as they ascended, with paths that seemed designed to discourage visitors. On the afternoon of the second day, they found the valley described in the diary. 7 structures remained standing, though time and weather had reduced them to skeletal frames. The expedition approached cautiously, calling out to announce their presence, but only silence answered. What they discovered in that valley would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The compound was a monument to genetic catastrophe. In the main cabin, they found remains that suggested the family had continued living there until at least 1910, just 2 years before. But the evidence indicated their final years had been marked by rapid decline. Dr. Harrington documented everything with clinical precision, though his journal entries reveal how deeply the scene affected him. In one cabin, they found the skeleton of what appeared to be an adult male, but the bone structure showed severe abnormalities. The spine curved at impossible angles. The skull displayed unusual thickness in some areas and disturbing thinness in others. The leg bones were different lengths, suggesting years of painful, uneven walking. In another structure, they discovered what might have been a makeshift medical area. Rough shelves held jars containing preserved specimens, though whether these were attempts at medical study or something darker remained unclear. The expedition found infant remains preserved in alcohol, each showing different developmental abnormalities. They had apparently been documenting their own genetic decline, though whether they understood what they were seeing remains unknown. Sheriff Burke found a family Bible in the main cabin, and its pages told a genealogical story that confirmed the diary entries. The family tree didn't branch. It tangled back on itself like a snake eating its tail. Names appeared multiple times in different generations. The same individuals served as both parents and grandparents to the same children. The connections grew so convoluted that tracing any single line became nearly impossible. Thomas Webb discovered something that suggested they had finally recognized their situation's hopelessness. In a cleared area behind the main cabin, they found a cemetery containing 47 marked graves. The dates suggested an acceleration of deaths beginning around 1900. Infant graves clustered together in heartbreaking numbers. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of graves from 1911 and 1912, the years covered in the diary, showing that the final members had died in rapid succession. Abraham Cole, the mountain guide, found evidence that other mountain communities had known about them and deliberately avoided them. He discovered markers along the paths, old symbols carved into trees that served as warnings to travelers. They had become Appalachian bogeymen, a cautionary tale used to frighten children and reinforce the importance of seeking marriage partners from outside one's immediate community. As Dr. Harrington continued reading the diary against the backdrop of the abandoned compound, the written words took on new dimensions. An entry from October 3, 1911, described a community meeting where the eldest member, a man named Ezekiel, who was uncle, brother, and grandfather to various family members, had finally acknowledged that their children were born weaker with each generation. But even then, he had refused to allow outsiders into the family, claiming that God was testing their faith. She wrote about arguments that turned violent. She described how her brother cousin Samuel had tried to leave the valley to find a wife in Harland, only to be dragged back by uncles and confined to a root cellar for weeks. When they finally released him, his spirit was broken, and he married his own sister-niece in a ceremony that she described as more funeral than wedding. The diary revealed that she herself had been promised to multiple male relatives before finally being assigned to Uncle Vernon. She wrote about her wedding night with devastating honesty, describing her fear, her pain, and her growing certainty that she was participating in something fundamentally wrong. Within 3 months, she was pregnant. Within 6 months, she had miscarried a child she described as not properly formed. Dr. Harrington found entries showing that she had tried to convince others to leave the valley. She had pleaded with the younger members to run away, to find lives beyond the mountains, to break the cycle that was consuming them. But the older generation maintained iron control, and those who questioned the family ways were punished severely. She described beatings, long periods of confinement, and psychological manipulation that convinced family members that the outside world was dangerous and corrupt. The most heartbreaking entries came from late 1911, when she began to lose hope. She wrote about watching her cousin's sister Martha die during childbirth at age 17. She described helping bury another malformed infant, the 12th that year. She chronicled her own deteriorating health, increasing confusion, episodes where she couldn't remember entire days, painful swelling in her joints that made walking difficult. But her final entries, written in early 1912, revealed something unexpected. She had found an ally in her grandmother Aunt Rebecca, an elderly woman who had lived long enough to see 4 generations of genetic decline. Rebecca had secretly been teaching her about herbs and remedies, but more importantly, she had been encouraging her to document everything in her diary. Rebecca knew the family line was ending, and she wanted someone someday to understand what had happened in that isolated valley. The entries from February 1912 marked a turning point in her understanding. She wrote, "Grandmother Rebecca told me today that we are cursed, but not by God or the devil. She says we cursed ourselves. She showed me her hands twisted like tree roots and said her mother's hands looked normal. She showed me her brother husband's grave and told me he was the first one born with the shaking sickness. She said every generation we get weaker. Every generation more babies die. Every generation the pain gets worse. And she said it's because we keep marrying our own blood." Dr. Harrington shared this entry with Sheriff Burke, who sat in silence for several minutes before speaking. Clayton Burke was not an educated man in the formal sense, but decades of mountain living had given him a practical wisdom that recognized truth when he heard it. He told Dr. Harrington about other isolated families in Appalachia, communities where similar patterns had emerged, though rarely to the extent seen in that valley. The expedition spent 3 days documenting the compound. Dr. Harrington took measurements, made sketches, and collected what records remained. He found evidence that multiple physicians had visited the valley over the years, though their recommendations to bring in outside bloodlines had been violently rejected. One doctor's journal, discovered in a trunk, described being threatened with weapons and escorted out of the valley after suggesting that they needed to marry beyond their family circle. Thomas Webb found her cabin, identifiable by details she had described in her diary. It was smaller than the others, set slightly apart from the main compound. Inside, they discovered more evidence of her final months. Letters she had written but never sent, addressed to authorities in Haaland begging for help. Drawings that showed family trees with notes in the margins documenting physical afflictions associated with specific lineages. A small box containing locks of hair from babies who hadn't survived, each labeled with a name and date. But the most significant discovery came when Abraham Cole noticed disturbed earth near the tree line. Digging carefully, they uncovered a metal box that contained additional journals. These ones were written by Rebecca. The elderly woman had been documenting the family's decline for decades, creating a record that complemented the younger woman's diary. Rebecca's entries were less emotional but more comprehensive, listing every birth, every death, every marriage, and every physical abnormality that manifested across 4 generations. Rebecca's journals revealed that she had tried to convince family patriarchs to change their ways as early as 1890. She had witnessed her own children suffer, watched her grandchildren born with increasing problems, and seen her great-grandchildren fail to thrive. Her final entry, dated November 1911, expressed her certainty that the family line would end within a generation, perhaps within years. She wrote, "We have bred ourselves into a corner from which there is no escape. The damage is written into our very bones now." Dr. Harrington cross-referenced the 2 diaries, creating a comprehensive picture of the family's final years. The pattern was undeniable. In 1860, the family had numbered over 80 individuals spread across the valley. By 1900, they had declined to 53. By 1910, only 31 remained. And the physical conditions affecting them had grown progressively worse with each passing year. The doctor identified multiple genetic disorders that had compounded across generations. Skeletal abnormalities appeared in nearly every family member after 1890. Neurological conditions, including seizures, tremors, and cognitive impairment, became increasingly common. Infant mortality rates exceeded 70% by 1900. Of the babies who survived birth, fewer than half lived past their 5th year. An entry from March 1912 provided devastating insight into the family's final collapse. She described a winter that had killed 6 people, including Uncle Vernon, her husband of less than a year. She wrote about the remaining members gathering to discuss their options. Some wanted to continue as they always had, trusting in Providence. Others, led by Rebecca, argued that they needed to open the family to outsiders or face extinction. The argument had turned violent. She described men fighting in the snow, old grudges erupting into physical confrontation. She wrote about women screaming, children crying, the community fragmenting before her eyes. The meeting ended with the family fractured into factions, each occupying different cabins, barely speaking to one another. And now here, in this exact moment, I need you to understand something that she wrote in her final pages. Something that applies not just to them, but to anyone who's ever kept dark secrets hidden in isolated places. She said, "Silence protects no one. Truth, no matter how painful, is the only medicine that heals." If those words resonate with you, if you believe that hidden histories must be brought to light, leave a comment right now saying, "Silence protects no one." So I know you're truly paying attention to what we're uncovering here. Her final diary entries were written in April 1912, and they documented the complete collapse of the community. Her handwriting had deteriorated significantly, suggesting that her own physical and mental condition was declining rapidly. Yet her observations remained sharp, recording details that would prove invaluable to understanding what happened in that isolated valley. She wrote about the spring thaw revealing graves that had been dug in frozen ground, about the discovery that food stores were insufficient for the remaining family members, about the realization that too few healthy adults remained to maintain the compound. They had survived in isolation for over a century but had finally reached a point where their genetic damage made simple survival impossible. Dr. Harrington found evidence supporting her accounts throughout the compound. The root cellars contained spoiled provisions, suggesting inadequate preservation knowledge among the remaining family members. The fields showed signs of poor planting, with seeds scattered randomly rather than in proper rows. The livestock areas stood empty, indicating that animals had either died or wandered away. The infrastructure that had sustained the family for generations had crumbled as the people capable of maintaining it succumbed to their accumulated genetic burden. An entry from April 12, 1912, described a final family meeting. Only 14 remained alive, 8 adults and 6 children. Of the adults, only 3 were mentally and physically capable of functioning independently. The others required constant care, suffering from conditions that ranged from severe cognitive impairment to physical disabilities so profound they couldn't perform basic self-care. Rebecca, now 84 years old and suffering from the accumulated effects of a lifetime of inbreeding, made a final speech that was recorded in detail. The old woman acknowledged the family's mistakes, accepted responsibility for perpetuating practices she had known were harmful, and released any remaining members from their obligation to stay in the valley. She gave permission for anyone who could leave to seek lives elsewhere, to marry outside the family, to break the cycle. But by then, it was too late for most of them. The physical conditions that plagued the remaining members made leaving the mountains impossible. Severe skeletal deformities prevented long-distance travel. Cognitive impairments made navigating the outside world unthinkable. And generations of isolation had left them without the social skills or knowledge necessary to integrate into normal society. She wrote that she and 2 cousins, Joshua and Mary, were the only ones physically capable of attempting the journey to Harland. But Mary refused to leave her young children, who were too sick to travel. Joshua, despite being only 26, suffered from joint problems so severe that he could barely walk. That left her as perhaps the only one with both the physical capacity and the mental determination to escape. Her final entries described her preparations. She gathered what few valuables the family possessed, a small amount of money saved from their last trading visits to Gray's Knob, some silver items passed down from the original patriarch, and documents she hoped would help establish her identity. She wrote letters to be left behind, explaining what had happened and asking that someone come to help those who remained. But her last diary entry, dated April 26, 1912, revealed a heartbreaking decision. She wrote, "I prepared to leave today, had everything ready, walked to the valley entrance, but I looked back and saw the cabins, saw the smoke from the fires, thought about grandmother Rebecca and cousin Mary and the children. I thought about how they will die alone if I leave. How there will be no one to bury them proper or say words over their graves. And I knew I cannot go, cannot leave them. This valley is my curse and my duty. I will stay until the end." The entry concluded with a final paragraph that Dr. Harrington read aloud to the others. "I hide this diary under the floorboards of my cabin. Someday someone will find it. They will read about us. They will know what we did to ourselves. And maybe, just maybe, it will stop some other family from making the same mistakes we made. We thought we were staying pure. But we were just destroying ourselves, generation by generation, until nothing remained but pain and sorrow and regret." Dr. Harrington's investigation revealed that she had indeed stayed. Among the remains found in the main cabin was a female skeleton with characteristics matching her self-descriptions, the overlapping teeth, the asymmetrical skull suggesting her wandering eye, the joint abnormalities she had mentioned. Tests later suggested she had died sometime in late 1912 or early 1913, possibly from pneumonia or influenza, conditions her weakened body couldn't fight. The last member apparently died around 1914. The expedition found no evidence that anyone lived in the valley after that date. An entire family line stretching back to the 18th century had simply ceased to exist, consumed by genetic damage so severe that it rendered them incapable of survival. Sheriff Burke reported his findings to county authorities, who dispatched additional teams to document the site. Physicians and scientists from universities in Kentucky and Tennessee traveled to the valley to study the remains and records. The case became one of the most thoroughly documented examples of inbreeding consequences in American history. But the most important legacy was the diary itself. Dr. Harrington ensured it was preserved and later published in medical journals, though with names changed to protect the deceased. The diary became required reading in medical schools, a powerful illustration of genetic principles that were only beginning to be understood in the early 20th century. The story resonated far beyond the mountains of eastern Kentucky. As Dr. Harrington shared his findings with the medical community, the case became a touchstone for discussions about genetics, heredity, and the consequences of restricted breeding populations. Universities sent researchers to study the compound over the following years. They documented everything: the skeletal remains showing progressive deterioration across generations, the family records revealing increasingly tangled bloodlines, the physical evidence of a community that had destroyed itself through self-imposed isolation. The research papers published from these studies helped establish foundational principles in the emerging field of genetics. But the scientific impact was only part of the story. The diary, when finally published in accessible form in 1923, reached a much broader audience. Rural communities across Appalachia read it, recognizing warnings relevant to their own situations. Isolated farming communities in other parts of America saw parallels to their circumstances. The diary became a cautionary tale taught in schools, a powerful reminder of why genetic diversity matters. Sheriff Clayton Burke spent his remaining years working to identify other isolated communities in the mountains that might be following similar patterns. He coordinated with physicians and social workers to reach out to remote families, encouraging them to seek marriage partners from outside their immediate communities. His efforts helped prevent several potential situations from developing into similar tragedies. The mountain community near Harland never forgot them. The valley where they lived remained abandoned, considered cursed by superstitious locals, but others recognized it as a memorial to hubris and isolation, a place that demonstrated the importance of community connection and genetic diversity. In 1953, the state of Kentucky placed a historical marker near the valley entrance, acknowledging what had happened there without sensationalizing the tragedy. Dr. Samuel Harrington continued his work in rural Appalachia for another 30 years. But this case shaped everything he did afterward. He became an advocate for rural health education, working to ensure that isolated communities understood basic principles of heredity and the importance of diverse family connections. His papers on the family remained influential in medical education well into the late 20th century. The scientific understanding that emerged from studying this case helped shape modern genetics. Researchers identified how recessive genes, normally hidden in diverse populations, became expressed when relatives married repeatedly across generations. They documented how small populations could experience rapid genetic decline. They demonstrated conclusively what many had suspected: human beings, like all sexually reproducing species, require genetic diversity to maintain health across generations. But perhaps the most profound impact was on how communities thought about themselves and their relationships. The story became part of Appalachian culture, a story told around fires and dinner tables, a reminder that isolation and insularity taken to extremes lead to destruction. It reinforced traditional values about seeking spouses from neighboring communities, about maintaining connections with the wider world, about the dangers of believing your family alone possesses special virtue requiring protection from outside influence. Her final wish, expressed in her diary, came true. Her words did reach the outside world. They did educate people about what happened when families closed themselves off too completely. And while it's impossible to quantify how many potential tragedies were prevented by her testimony, historical records suggest that the publicity around this case did change behavior in isolated communities across rural America. The valley itself gradually returned to wilderness. The structures collapsed under the weight of weather and time. Trees grew through foundations. Vines covered what remained. Nature reclaimed the space where they had tried to create their pure, isolated world. But the lessons from that place lived on, preserved in her diary and in the scientific studies conducted by Dr. Harrington and his colleagues. In the 21st century, this case remains relevant. Geneticists studying rare diseases reference it when explaining founder effects and genetic bottlenecks. Anthropologists cite it when discussing the risks of cultural isolation. Historians use it to illustrate life in rural America during the transition from frontier to modern society. And medical ethicists point to it when discussing the importance of informed consent and the dangers of traditional practices maintained without questioning. The story concludes not with triumph or redemption, but with the quiet dignity of one young woman's choice to stay with her suffering family and her determination to leave a record that might prevent future tragedies. Her voice, preserved in fading ink on yellowed pages, continues to speak across more than a century, reminding us that silence protects no one, that isolation breeds suffering, and that the truth, no matter how painful, ultimately serves the cause of preventing future harm. If you made it to this moment in the story, you understand why this diary mattered then and matters now. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you never miss these forgotten histories that shaped our understanding of genetics, family, and community. If you watched all the way through because you recognize the importance of preserving and learning from these difficult stories, leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who truly values these deep dives into hidden American history. Hit the like button if this story impacted you and made you think differently about the importance of community connection and genetic diversity. And share this video with anyone who appreciates real history, the kind that textbooks often skip but that teaches us the most important lessons about human nature and the consequences of our choices. This story deserves to be remembered. And by sharing it, you ensure that her sacrifice in documenting her family's tragedy continues to educate and warn future generations.